What's up guys? So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics when it comes to saving and investing. And that's the ability to retire early and become financially independent. Financial independence, retire early movement, or the FIRE movement, has become a popular trend in recent years. It's essentially a way of working really hard and saving as much money as you can just to retire early. There's so many stories of people that just really grind it out for 5 to 10 years, like working as software engineers, and then being able to retire in their 30s or their 40s. They end up living really cheaply and then basically just investing all of their money into passive index funds. And for the most part, the dividends that they get on these index funds, as well as the capital growth, is basically enough for them to be able to retire on and provide them with an unlimited source of money for the rest of their life. Whilst I think it is really important to enjoy life in the present, I think it's also really great that a lot of young people are really starting to see the value of their time and therefore plan to achieve financial independence early. Now, this is something which is definitely possible, but there is a lot of misleading content online about how you can retire early. Like, there's usually a lot of people that are trying to sell you a course or all these clickbait articles. So in today's video, let's actually go through some proper numbers and see whether you can realistically retire early. So there are a lot of people out there that say it is possible to retire by the age of 30. I just want to go through some figures just to show that this is pretty unlikely. So firstly, if you want to make 6 figures, the chances are that you'll need to stick out a job after uni for at least 3 to 5 years. And then at that point, it's a pretty tedious process of trying to save as much money as you can. And if you live in a high tax country like Australia, it's going to take a while for you to be able to save up your money and actually start to invest a significant amount as well. Even if you were to be earning a 6-figure salary straight out of university, you could be paying about 30 to 40% of that into taxes, meaning that obviously your take-home pay is going to be a lot less. Then there's also the issue of most likely having to live with your parents all throughout your 20s just to save money. And I don't know about you guys, but having to live at home with your parents even after you finish uni is really only something that should be temporary or a means to an end. So the point I'm trying to make here is that unless you do decide to live at home with your parents for like the next 20 or 30 years, retiring early just on a salary or investing isn't going to really be possible. Now, the second option would be for you to try and start a business during your 20s, or maybe even a side hustle to grow your income just beyond your full-time job. But the estimates show that 1 in 3 new small businesses in Australia fail within their first year, half by the end of the second year, and 3/4 by the end of the 5th year. Now, I'm all for the idea of expanding your wealth beyond just a normal 9-to-5 job, because we know that regardless of how much money you make from your job, that's going to be really difficult for you to be able to buy multiple properties or have a multi-million-dollar share portfolio. Just the money from a full-time job alone is probably not going to be enough for you to be able to buy multiple properties or invest into $1 million stock portfolio. Like, even if you made $1 million a year in a job and you lived in a high tax country like Australia, United States, or the UK, you'd already be paying half that towards taxes. Then you'd probably have private school fees as well, be about 100, maybe even 150 grand a year. And then there's also mortgage fees and everything else that you've got to pay for. Meaning that you're probably only taking home maybe at most 300K out of $1 million salary every year. So what that means is that even on earning $1 million every year, you'd have to stick out that job for at least 10 years just to get to a point where you've been able to save several $million. And I don't know about you guys, but trying to stick out a job like that for 10 years would be incredibly stressful. Probably end up gonna have a heart attack before the end of 10 years. So with this in mind, you've got to start looking at other ways that you can expand your wealth beyond just a 9-to-5 job. Unfortunately though, a lot of people don't realize how tough it is going into business. All the planning, research, product launches, marketing, sales, financial management, all this sort of stuff. You also need to think about whether there's going to be any market demand, whether you can even create market demand, what the competition is like, how you're going to finance your business, and whether there's any legal requirements as well. And to be honest, most, if not all of these skills aren't going to be learnt either at school or uni. They're only going to be learnt through direct experience. And this is why so many successful business owners initially had businesses that failed. Like before, when Bill Gates became a billionaire with Microsoft, he started a company called Traf-O-Data, which ultimately failed. Jeff Bezos, who became a billionaire from Amazon, originally also started a website called Z Shops, which didn't get any customers at all. So whilst I think it's a great idea to pursue business, it's probably not going to make you a multi-millionaire by the time you're 30. So with that all said, how do you actually retire early? Well, the answer is you're probably not going to retire by 30, and you certainly can retire early if you save as much money as you can and start investing as early as possible. Now, to start, you only get out of investing what you put in, unless you do decide to take out a margin loan, but to be honest, that's probably not the best idea, especially if you're someone without any investing experience. So step one is to try and save as much money as you can as possible. Now, there are stories of people that save about 70% of their take-home pay in order to retire early, which is great. But for a lot of other people, I know that this isn't possible. So therefore, try and at least start to save 10% of your income. And if you're really keen, think about how you can increase that even more. I talk a lot about this sort of stuff in my YouTube channel, but saving money and building wealth doesn't involve making huge changes to your lifestyle. It actually really just involves making cuts on lots of small things that end up adding up to lots of money, like takeaway coffees and lunches. These are things which don't really bring much value to your life, but could actually make a huge difference to it in the long term if you cut them out. And then from there, it's basically just a matter of consistently trying to invest that money either into the stock market or into the property market. With stocks, it's basically where they increase in value and pay out dividends. And for property, it's either the capital gain or the rental income. Now, personally, I do think that investing in the stock market is better than investing in property to start off with for a few reasons, but it's mainly because you don't actually need that much money to start investing to begin with. Like, you really only need $500 to start buying shares online as opposed to tens of thousands of dollars to buy your first investment property. So now that you're ready to buy some shares, where do you start? Well, the best place to start off with is probably some low-cost index funds or ETFs. ETFs are basically like shares that you can buy online, except they're not a share in a single company. It's a share that's made up of hundreds or sometimes even thousands of stocks. So for example, if you went to buy IOZ as a ETF, you would pay about $30 for a share of IOZ. What that means is that for that $30, you're buying into the top 200 companies on the Australian Stock Exchange. Now, the great thing about ETFs, especially passive ones like IOZ, is that the management fee is usually pretty low, and they typically pay dividends as well. And it's not like you have to stay up all night worrying about if your investments are going to tank, because if one company plunges and bombs, then that's only going to have a very, very small impact on the share price of your ETF. Now, I should also say that before you do start investing, you do need some emergency cash saved aside. And it's best to have this in a high interest savings account that you can access at any time. This means that if you do lose your job, you won't be forced to sell any of your shares or investments. Now, with that in mind, you can now start to calculate how much your money is going to grow over the next several years by looking at the historical rate of return of the stock market. The stock market has an average return of about 7% per year, meaning that if you saved and invested $10,000, after 1 year, you'd have $10,700. Obviously, this is an assumption. Not every single year you're going to be consistently returning 7%. Some years you could be returning 20%. Some years it could be 30%, sometimes 0%, and sometimes even negative 20%. But what's really fascinating is that if you now keep that $10,700 invested in the stock market for an additional year, you're now making a yearly return of $749 from year 1 to year 2. And that's because that 7% rate of return is no longer on the $10,000 that you were originally invested. It's now on the $10,700 that you now have at year 1. You're basically just making more money off that same money. And if you leave this and let it compound over several decades, watch and look what happens. That $10,000 is now going to be worth almost $750,000. Like, if you invested $10,000 back in 1980 and you just left it, you didn't do anything at all with it, and you didn't even invest any more money at all, that money would be worth $760,000 today. This is basically a guaranteed way of becoming a millionaire. And it's not by buying lottery tickets. It's not by trying to just save up all your money. It's by investing it in low-cost funds or ETFs and letting your investments grow over decades. And the great thing about this approach is that you don't have to invest $10,000 every single time. You can just consistently invest a little bit of money every month and still get the same returns when you want to retire. $500 invested every month over 30 years is going to be worth $1.1 million by the end of that period. These figures are looking at a rate of return of just 7%. And it's certainly possible to make more if you do heaps of research. and find good businesses to invest in. It's certainly possible to get 10, 15, or even 20% average annual rate of returns every year. So that was an example with only $10,000 invested. But what happens if you actually work really hard, you try and save even more of your money, and you get a second job or a side hustle to be able to fund most of your lifestyle during that process? If you earned $80,000 a year before tax or $63,000 a year after tax, and you managed to save and invest just around half your income, or let's say 30 grand every year, over the next 5 years, you would have invested during that time 150 grand. If you then just leave that and let that compound over the next 30 years, your investments would grow to over $1.1 million during that time. I don't know about you guys, but just saving and working hard just for, only 5 years of my life so I can retire a millionaire sounds like a pretty good deal for me. And if you saved more, you invested earlier, and you did some more research and got better investment returns, you could have even more money to retire on earlier as well. So now that you're consistently saving and investing every year, now you can really start to have a think about how much money you actually need to be able to retire off. At the making of this video, my net worth is around $300,000. And that means that if I just simply leave my investments as they are, my net worth will then grow to $2.6 million by the time I'm 60 years old. And if I invest more during this time, I'll definitely be on track to have even more money by the time I'm ready to retire at 60. But once you start to get to hundreds of thousands of dollars or even $1 million, now you're starting to make a pretty decent passive income. The 7% return that you make on $10,000 in your first year is only going to give you $700. But since you've let that investment grow over several decades, now you're making a 7% return, so the same return, but now it's on $1 million, not $10,000 anymore. That means that your 7% return is going to make you 70 grand a year on $1 million. Imagine being able to make that much money on passive income alone. For some people, that's basically their full-time wage, and they don't even have to lift a finger. And this is the really exciting part, because now you can start to have a serious think about how much money you really need to live and retire on. And the great thing about this is that you don't have to quit your job in order to retire either. It could just mean that you no longer want to work in a full-time job and instead just drop down to part-time. Or maybe you instead just maybe want to pursue a job that doesn't pay as much, but you actually really enjoy and find really fulfilling. Or maybe you want to pursue a passion that initially isn't going to make much money at all to begin with, but if you really stick it out for a couple of years, you'll go on to make more and more money. Another way to technically retire early is what's called coast fire. And that's basically where you save and invest as much as you can as early as possible. And then you just let your money save there and accumulate investment growth returns in the long term whilst you take on some cushy job like a barista. So during that time, you don't have to work your way up the corporate ladder. You can just simply get a job that's just going to pay your everyday bills, meaning that you don't have to dip into your investments, just to let it grow over time, year on year. But I think what's really motivating about this idea is not having to be financially dependent on a job as a source of income. Like if you do lose your job or if you do get fired, that's okay, because you're essentially just earning the same wage through your investments. So that's it from me, guys. I really hope you find this content helpful. It's been pretty hard uploading videos over the last few months, but I promise you guys, I'm now going to go back to consistently uploading content every week. I'm hoping to eventually also get this channel monetized as well, so please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe as well. Thanks again.